Hey guys, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I'm joined today by Jimmy Akin below and Dr. Gavin Ortlund. Over there in the bottom corner, he runs the YouTube channel Truth Unites. And I thought it would be fun to actually have Jimmy and Gavin kind of team up to respond to Paulogia. Recently released a video where he basically lays out, and I was actually kind of excited about this because he lays out his natural explanation of how Christianity started, why it's here. And you don't really see this a lot of times. And he was actually responding to Gary Habermas. That's why you see Gary Habermas in the thumbnail of this video, is because he was responding to a book that Gary Habermas just recently wrote, where he basically defends the resurrection, talks about all the history and everything. And so in that book, Gary Habermas mentions that a lot of naturalists aren't willing to defend a hypothesis that explains how Christianity began, the facts that surround Jesus' resurrection. And so what he attempts to do in his video is give an explanation, a natural explanation of how Christianity began. And so that's, like I said, it's kind of exciting to me because you don't really see that too often, where he tries to give like a complete explanation. But it's going to be a very, very, I think, interesting stream for you guys once we start to get into the details. Because once we started to look at this video over the course of about a week or two, and as we dug deeper and deeper, we found some really interesting things. So we'll just put it that way. The title of the video is "Demolishing Paulogia's Natural Explanation of Christianity," and that term actually I think is pretty accurate. Like it's going to be demolished. But let me turn it over to you guys. Jimmy, it's great to have you back. What were your thoughts on this video? And then we'll turn it over to Gavin.
Well, I appreciate that Paulogia is trying to, provide a naturalistic explanation of the origin of Christianity that doesn't have an actual resurrection in it. That is something that Habermas correctly notes is often not really tackled by skeptical and secular scholars. They frequently will acknowledge a lot of the minimal claim evidences that Habermas and others cite in their defenses of the resurrection, but then they kind of wash out when it comes to actually explaining, well, what did happen then? And so I appreciate the fact that Paulogia attempted to provide an explanation that was purely naturalistic. At the same time, I think his case is marred by a few things. Just in summary form, he's beginning with false and closed-minded, anti-supernaturalistic philosophical assumption, which kind of is the beginning point for his discussion. He then lists 12 factors that he says should be relatively non-controversial, that he thinks explain the Christian faith. Most of them don't have anything, or I don't know, I'd say most, but many of them do not have anything to do with the resurrection. And then when he gets to material that does engage with the resurrection, he cherry picks the data hard. And it appears he's not even familiar with some of the sources that he's citing.
I was actually kind of thinking up a name that we could call his hypothesis, because he calls it the minimal witnesses hypothesis, but it's like you said, he kind of, minimal witness. Yeah.
Because he ultimately, he thinks only Peter saw Jesus, and it all sprang from Peter.
Mm-hmm. But I was trying to think up a name that we should, that's a little bit more accurate, and maybe something like minimal cherries hypothesis. There's a lot of cherry picking going on in the data, and I think you guys, as you're watching, you'll be able to see that as well. But Gavin, let's turn it over to you. Let's get your thoughts before we actually open up the video. We'll also see, just kind of like, if you guys have never heard of Paulogia, you've never heard of his channel, you've never heard of anything that he does, we'll just take a brief overview of what he kind of does on his channel, and then we'll get into the specifics of his video. But Gavin, any thoughts before we begin?
Yeah, it's fun to team up with you guys because I think we'll be of one mind on this particular topic. I think, if I understand correctly, his basic case requires all of the 12 events that he is laying out to work in order for the whole theory to work. And he calls them relatively uncontroversial. As I started going to them, I got to number 3, and I realized this is not relatively uncontroversial. Numbers 3 and 4, I think, are where I'll save a lot of my comments for. Not only are they not uncontroversial, I would say that they're actually, from my vantage point, skipping around where the discussion is. So a lot of the points that need to get reviewed and are reviewed by historians when they're wrestling with these points of data don't even come into the picture. When you were talking about the burial of Christ, he doesn't talk about Joseph of Arimathea and the early traditions and so forth. When he talks about the disciples, he doesn't talk about James, the brother of Jesus, and all the historical evidence for his existence, for example, in addition to Peter. So radical skepticism, but then not actually engaging with the source material to justify that skepticism is kind of how I would summarize my reaction to several of his events. So yeah, I'll get into the specifics as we go, but that would be my general response.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, I can't remember how much detail I went into when we just opened the stream, but there are some very surprising things that we found in not a good way. So I don't want to spoil anything too soon, but we will start to look at some of these sources that he cites, and we found some problems with those. I'll put it that way. So let's now turn to Paulogia's channel. This is what it looks like. He's got 127,000 subscribers. These are his latest videos. So what actually kind of surprised me is that this is the one we're going to be taking a look at, the minimal witnesses video here. You can't see my mouse hovering over it, but that's the video we'll be taking a look at. 11 days ago, 42,000 views, which seems to me actually kind of on the low end for the amount of views that his videos normally get. So 59,000, 40,000 is another one, 83,000, 24,000, 43, 57, 53. So I guess actually sort of in that area. Maybe the videos that pop up on my feed are the more popular ones. I don't know. But yeah, so that around there, I suppose, is the amount of views that his videos normally get. And this one, I think, maybe on the low end because...
Who wouldn't want to watch a video about a T-Rex eating a watermelon? That sounds awesome.
Debunking the T-Rex ate watermelon movie. Wow. Yeah. But yeah, that's a little about Paulogia, 127,000 subscribers. Let's go ahead and click on the video. Let's just get started, and then we'll be pausing the video along the way and providing comments and stuff. There is some action that happens at the beginning, but what we'll spend most of the time on is looking in detail at each of the 12 points that he brings up that allegedly explain Christianity. One last thing to mention is that Gavin actually has a hard cutoff at about an hour. So we've only got him for another 45 minutes or so. So we're going to go through this as quickly as possible. Once Gavin leaves, fortunately, Jimmy has a little bit more time, so we'll be able to finish out with just Jimmy and I. So let's begin. Let's go ahead and click on the video here.
Unbelievers are retreating, or so says resurrection expert Dr. Gary Habermas.
Let me mention, let me pull up the description. So this is actually, he's just reading an article that was posted on the Bart Ehrman website. So this is what it looks like on the Bart Ehrman website. I think it is just bartehrman.com. Yeah. So he wrote this as a blog entry for Bart Ehrman. And it's kind of surprising to me, given what we found with the sources and some of the stuff that we've uncovered as we've looked into this, it's a little bit surprising to me that this was sort of allowed to be published on his blog. Maybe the editors, I doubt Bart Ehrman himself is reviewing these blog posts, but maybe they just didn't really read it carefully enough or paid close enough attention. But part of the reason that I mentioned this is that he was basically just reading this article, and I've got it linked. Well, I've got the video linked in the description, but if you guys want to go read the article instead of listening to the video, which in the article, he's got his sources linked and stuff. And so it's a little bit easier to kind of follow the arguments and stuff. So that's the way that I would recommend checking out. And if you guys want to look deeper into what his hypothesis actually is, that's what I would recommend. Gavin, did you want to say something?
Nope.
I was gonna mention that they do have a disclaimer on the Bart Ehrman blog saying that this is presented as is. It's not necessarily Bart's opinion, but they apparently feel it's got some good stuff in it from their point of view.
Yeah, good enough to at least post. Yeah, well, that's what I wanted to mention is that he's basically just kind of orating this article or blog post that he wrote for the Bart Ehrman blog website. So that's what you're seeing here. Unfortunately, it's only 12 minutes long, but as I say, we'll kind of pause and provide comments throughout. So let's continue.
Toward the end of his recently released 1,000-page first volume of his Resurrection Evidence tome, Habermas contends that there is a lack of scholars who are willing to embrace and defend a single naturalistic hypothesis to explain early belief in the resurrection of Jesus.
Preferring a general shotgun approach that basically presents several alternatives where the critic can switch back and forth between the options if one or two become problematic in the aftermath of the ensuing discussion.
Few skeptical champions are standing up,
apparently due to the strength of the contrary data.
But it may not behoove prominent academics to focus on promoting specific pet theories in lieu of prioritizing the broader, more foundational principles in their field. As Dr. Ehrman notes, any other scenario, no matter how unlikely, is more likely than the one in which a great miracle occurred.
Right,
okay. Yeah, thank you, because I was going to ask. So this is where he makes an anti-supernaturalistic philosophical assumption. He's basically retreading an argument that was popularized by David Hume in his discussion of miracles, that miracles, even if they occur, are so unlikely that any other natural explanation is going to be more plausible than a miracle report. And this is purely philosophical. This is not an evidential way of reasoning. The evidential way of reasoning is to look at the observations, look at the evidence, and say, do these evidences point towards something miraculous happening or not? And not making you could make a prediction and say, well, miracles aren't that common based on the evidence we have. So if you asked at a particular day and time in a particular location, did a miracle happen? Well, before you have any evidence to look at, the safe bet would be no. But once you have evidence to look at, you need to look at the evidence and say, in hindsight, did a miracle occur or not? And you can't just wish away evidence or put your thumb on the scale in such a way that you're just never going to accept the evidence. That's not an open-minded position. That's an anti-supernaturalistic philosophical position. So I think it's important to realize that Paulogia's case is being driven by his philosophical commitments rather than his reading of the evidence.
I was basically going to say the exact same thing at this point. It's a philosophical statement, not a historical statement. It would need to be justified philosophically. And I think if viewers want to kind of get into that question, I still think C.S. Lewis's book Miracles is a great, readable, popular level treatment of that question. But this happens a lot where a historian will sort of smuggle in some philosophy without justifying it philosophically, and then just proceed with the historical evidence and examining that. The appeal that I would just love to make to viewers is, wouldn't it be more open-minded and more truly oriented to the earnest quest of truth to simply look at all the options, all the explanations, rather than just the non-miraculous ones?
I'm actually looking at the comments, and someone is saying, I can see this whole video is going to be missing the point of Paul's video. And I don't think that's true. What we're doing right now is we're kind of looking at the very opening, which I was surprised to see this actually in the opening, but he does give this argument. I don't know that I would actually call it an argument, but he mentions that Bart Ehrman, at least, has this belief that any other scenario, no matter how unlikely, is going to be more likely than the one in which a quote-unquote great miracle occurred. And so I think that's important, because I think it does inform perhaps the rest of his video, because what we're going to see is that, as we mentioned earlier, he does just kind of like cherry pick the data. He likes this piece of data, and so he'll include that and try to explain that. But then when other data that exists contradicts what he's claiming, he just kind of ignores it or calls it unreliable. And he doesn't really give any arguments, at least in this video, for those conclusions. But I think that it is important to touch on this, at least at the very beginning. So I don't think we're going to be missing his point. And we're going to be continuing the video in just a second, but I think it's also important to address this, because it is nevertheless like a very common argument that's brought up from skeptics is this Humean line of, no matter how unlikely these other hypotheses are, if you've got a miracle, if you're trying to hypothesize a miracle, it's just going to automatically be less likely. And there's a ton of literature on that subject, just a ridiculous amount. There's a lot of philosophers actually think that Hume was wrong on this, given some advancements in probability theory, specifically in Bayesian probability theory. There's ways in which, even if you think that miracles are just sort of like inherently really unlikely, you can still gather enough data that could make that hypothesis more probable than the other ones. And the way that all of that works out probabilistically is completely legitimate. And it's a little bit boring to go into the numbers and stuff, but it's a completely legitimate thing to do. And so just to assert that any other scenario is going to be more likely is question begging. It ignores some of the advancements in probability theory. It ignores even because I think Bayes was a contemporary of Hume back in the day. So it ignores like some of the stuff that was already said in response to Hume back in the day. And so it's just, it's a very lazy and I think philosophically uninformed position to take on this as well. Now, there are some contemporary philosophers who still want to go and defend Hume, but what they do is they have to provide this new argument to defend Hume. And I guess the point there would be that you actually have to do work. You can't just assert that miracles are going to be less likely. You actually have to give some sort of argument. You got to respond to this sort of standard objections that have been raised and stuff. So there's just a lot more work that needs to be done, I guess, is the kind of overall point. But let's go ahead and continue the video. Let's get into the 12 things that he says are what would explain Christianity. As you mentioned, Gavin, 3 and 4 are really, really spicy. There's a lot of stuff going on in those. So we'll get to those for sure before you head out. So let's get through 1 and 2 as quickly as we can here.
More likely than the one in which a great miracle occurred. That said, when I found my personal evangelical faith slipping away, a respected Christian mentor challenged me to answer one final question before closing the door. The thing we know for certain is that Christianity exists, he said. Can you explain the existence of the church without a resurrection? Though it took years of investigation and study, it turns out I can. Although the scholarly defense of each point could easily fill a full chapter in a book, the minimal witnesses hypothesis can be succinctly expressed as descriptions of 12 relatively uncontroversial naturalistic events that, in turn, gave rise to the Jesus movement, which eventually evolved into modern Christianity. 1. In the early 1st century, among the apocalyptic preachers active in Judea was one Jesus of Nazareth. For the sake of this discussion, we're assuming Jesus was a historical figure. The Dead Sea Scrolls, along with Josephus and Philo of Alexandria, and the wealth of apocalyptic literature like 1st Enoch, 4 Ezra, 2 Baruch, Jubilees, and Daniel, tell us that Jewish apocalypticism and apocalyptic preachers, such as John the Baptist, Judas of Galilee, and Thaddeus, were not uncommon in 1st century Judea. For over 100 years,
Okay, so we can start to comment on this. I also wanted to mention that as you see at the very bottom here, he cites his sources in the video in this bottom like black portion. So it's a little bit easier to actually click on these sources because he doesn't include them in the description. So if you want to go like click on the sources that he quotes or cites and stuff, you've got to go to the website in which the article was posted. So if you'd like to take a deeper look, again, just go to the article so you guys can take a closer look at his sources. But yeah, let's talk about this first one, which basically says that Jesus was an apocalyptic preacher.
Gavin, you want to go first, or you want me to?
I'll go first because I don't have a lot to say on this one. I think we can all sort of basically agree on this so far as it goes. None of us are going to deny that Jesus existed and that he preached and that some of his teaching was of an apocalyptic nature. This is one of the kind of classic ways of trying to give an account of the historical Jesus. You see it in some of the older German scholars, and then you see it in Bart Ehrman more recently. The question, of course, will be, is he only that, or can we say more about Christ? And then and then the things he tries to spin out of this as he goes are where I'll have my concerns. But I think so far as he goes, we can just sort of move forward. I don't have a lot to say on this one.
Yeah, my only comments are, well, he mispronounced Theudas as Thaddeus, but who cares? And he's saying something that is, in this case, is truly non-controversial. I mean, as Christian scholars don't have a problem with this. Jesus did have apocalyptic teachings. What that means for people who may not be familiar with that term is that Jesus predicted an imminent change in the world. And so he and John the Baptist were both apocalyptic preachers. They both said, repent and believe the gospel because the kingdom of God is coming, and in fact is even beginning with Jesus himself. And there was a transformation in the world from the Christian point of view. In Revelation 11:15, for example, it says, the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, the famous passage from Handel's Messiah. What that meant is that the kingdoms of the world, which had previously been under demonic domination, God has now reclaimed and begun working in them through his kingdom. So yeah, Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet, and he was right in the Christian view. God really did reclaim the nations from the demonic forces that were oppressing them. But this does nothing to undermine the resurrection, which is where we need to get to.
Yeah. That was kind of my thought too, as I was starting this video, was that this first one, it also seemed a little bit irrelevant in terms of explaining how Christianity began, but let's continue.
Scholarship has held that historical Jesus is best understood as an apocalyptic preacher. His earliest and most reliably attested sayings consistently align with apocalyptic themes, including the imminent arrival of God's kingdom, the call to repentance, and the anticipation of an eschatological reversal in which the righteous are rewarded and the wicked are punished. 2. This Jesus said or did controversial things which led to his crucifixion on a cross, a common practice at the time. While the infraction could have been anything, actions ascribed to Jesus, such as disturbing the peace in the temple or challenging Roman authority by claiming to be the Messiah or King of the Jews, would have been sufficient to warrant the death penalty under Roman rule. Medical research and historical record tell us death was all but certain for crucifixion victims.
Yeah, it was interesting that he mentioned events that occurred in the Gospels, but he obviously discounts those later on. But that's sort of what he uses in support of this number 2. Jesus said these things, like specifically the temple scene. So yeah, Jimmy, what did you have to say?
Oh, well, I was going to suggest that since Gavin has a hard out, why doesn't he go first? Why doesn't Gavin take the lead on these questions? Then I'll follow up with any additional thoughts.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, but let's, any thoughts on this number 2? Let me go ahead and back up so we can put it on the screen. Jesus did or said controversial things which led to his crucifixion on a cross, a common practice.
Yeah, I'll be briefer on this one too. I have a lot to say on 3 and 4, but this one as well, it's stated in a way that there's nothing that is said here that, strictly speaking, I would disagree with, but it doesn't go far enough, I would say, because there's this, again, a skepticism that I don't think is being justified. The kind of open-ended nature of the cause of Jesus's crucifixion here, that would be the interesting thing to get into and to explore. Most critical scholars accept some of the passages in the New Testament that at least appear to exhibit a claim to either a divine identity or some kind of messianic identity. So that would be the cause of Jesus's crucifixion that would need to be explored here. Jesus said or did controversial things. Well, that could be anything. And that kind of glides around where I think I would want to talk about passages like Mark 2 and Mark 14, where you have Jesus claiming to be, he basically says in Mark 2, when he heals the paralytic, that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. Now, Bart Ehrman says the Son of Man isn't Jesus, which I think is a really eccentric view. I think Jesus is referring to himself as the Son of Man, and he says he has authority to forgive sins. And Mark records that as in response to the Pharisees' concerns about the claim that to forgive sins is a claim of divinity. Now, someone can give counter arguments against that. I myself think that's a good testimony to the fact that Jesus did claim a kind of divine identity. But if someone would, that'd be the kind of thing that would need to be gotten into here a little bit in terms of, okay, why did Jesus get crucified? What are the controversial things he said? Mark 14 would be another example of this, where Jesus references, most people think he splices Psalm 110 and Daniel 7 at his trial, and basically claims a divine authority to judge the world. And in response to that, the high priest tears his clothes and accuses him of blasphemy. And these are two passages that are very early on. Most people think those do go back to the historical Jesus. So those would be the kind of passages that I think would be, that we need to get into to ask the more interesting question of, why did Jesus get crucified? And I would say you can make a really good case that the reason he got crucified was the concern of blasphemy, because he claimed to be God. I think a good case can be made for that. But the Paulogia's video here, by my lights, really isn't even getting into that question one way or the other.
So I would agree. I don't know why Paulogia is so ambiguous about what the charge was. He said it could have been anything. Well, we know that the Jews at this time did not have the ability to inflict capital punishment. So he was crucified by the Romans, and it would have to be a charge that was meaningful in Roman law. And the best and only proposal for what that charge was he claimed to be the king of the Jews, which was effectively usurping a right that only the Roman Senate could have conferred. And so he was viewed as a political revolutionary. And thus in John 19:19, Pilate, puts the placard above him saying, "This is Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." So he's being executed as a political rebel. But that charge had to be different for the Jewish leaders who turned him over to the Romans, because claiming to be the Messiah and claiming to be the King of the Jews, that was not a crime in Jewish law. We actually have, and I'd reference some work done by the scholar David Instone Brewer on this, but we actually have a really good idea of what the charge was from Jewish sources that mention Jesus. And it appears to have been a twofold charge. One part of it was he was charged with sorcery, which would be a reference to the miracles Jesus performed. And the other one is he enticed Israel to idolatry, which is, as Gavin illustrated, that's a reference to his own claims to divinity, which are right there in the Gospels. We also, from the Gospels, have clear indications of what the provocative actions that Jesus undertook were. By doing the triumphal entry, in fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, he announced himself publicly as the Messiah, and then he cleared the temple. And so he was deliberately, at this point, provoking the Jewish authorities so that he could fulfill his mission and go to the cross. But even though Paulogia is fundamentally correct on this point, which is not controversial, it still doesn't do anything to undermine the resurrection.
Yeah, let's continue with number 3 here.
Tell us death was all but certain for crucifixion victims. 3. The resting place of Jesus' body was unknown to his followers.
Well, as you guys can see, this is very, very controversial, which directly contradicts what he said earlier, that these are relatively uncontroversial. But yeah, let's hear what he has to say, though.
Apologists often focus on the timing of Jesus' body's removal, but the crucial question is who disposed of it. If the Romans were responsible, the body would have been left on the cross, possibly to be eaten by animals, as this humiliation was considered part of the punishment.
So we're going to be looking at these sources that he's citing here in defense of this third claim. So just buckle up. We're just going to continue watching, and then we'll look at the sources.
If a Judean religious exemption existed, despite explicit records to the contrary regarding Jesus' case of treason, the responsibility would have fallen to the family to successfully petition those in power. Mary, being of modest means and lacking influence, would have faced significant obstacles in securing the body and transporting it from Jerusalem to Nazareth for a simple pit grave. In the absence of family, the priesthood would have taken charge. However, Jewish law mandated that criminals be left in a separate, designated graveyards of the condemned in a dishonorable and secretive manner. In the expected scenarios, the location of Jesus' body remains unknown. For it to be otherwise would require the same authorities who condemned Jesus to honor him mere hours later, a notion nearly as implausible as a resurrection.
That was the most wild thing that I heard, I think, in this video. That Joseph, the story of Joseph of Arimathea is as unlikely as a resurrection occurring. Wild.
Yeah.
Well, Gavin, let's start with you on this number 3, and then we'll start to look at the sources, because I know that Jimmy has a lot to say on this one as well.
Yeah, it sort of felt like we went from extremely modest claims in 1 and 2 to an extremely difficult claim here in number 3. And I know you guys will have comments on some of the sources that he's going to go into, so I'll just respond at a more general level to this. So he's saying, he's framing it as the question is who buried Jesus? And then he's sort of giving these sort of speculative possibilities about family or the priesthood and so forth. But he doesn't really dive into these early traditions about Joseph of Arimathea. And I found that problematic. I mean, so in the New Testament, you have in all 4 Gospels a narrative about Joseph of Arimathea burying Jesus, going to Pilate, requesting the body, getting permission to bury Jesus. And Nicodemus is with him in John's account in Acts 13. It's also attested that the Sanhedrin as a whole, which is not inconsistent with some members of the Sanhedrin, contrary to Bart Ehrman, burying Jesus. We also have a more general reference to the burial of Christ in 1 Corinthians 15:4, which is a very early tradition. And basically, a lot of critical scholars take this tradition very seriously because it's the kind of claim that is difficult to make up. It's the kind of claim that would have been falsifiable if you're going to name a well-known figure who's a member of the Sanhedrin and who is very wealthy. And this is going to come out in multiple sources within living memory. So then, the problem with this is if you just make that up, or if Joseph of Arimathea didn't exist, or if he existed and he was a member of the Sanhedrin, but he didn't have anything to do with the burial of Jesus, or if he existed, but he wasn't a member of the Sanhedrin, or there's some kind of error in these traditions, people can point that out. It's a falsifiable claim. Someone can say, no, I know my dad was on the Sanhedrin, someone in the 60s AD, and say, no, I know Joseph of Arimathea didn't have anything to do with the burial of Jesus. This is false. So because it's a falsifiable claim that has multiple early attestation, this is a strong historical claim that would need to be engaged with for him to just dismiss the tradition about Joseph of Arimathea's burial. The other problem is, so he says basically the disciples didn't know about the location of the burial of Jesus, and he doesn't really discuss the claim in both Mark and Matthew and Luke that Mary, so there's 3 Marys in the New Testament, Mary the mother of Christ, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph. And in Mark 15:47, and as well as in Matthew and Luke, we're told that 2 of the Marys, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Joseph, witnessed where Jesus was laid. So people watching this video could look up Mark 15:47 as one example of that. Now, this also is the kind of thing that is hard to accept as just an embellishment or creative storytelling or something like this, rather than an oral memory. Because why would you include women? I know people make this argument a lot, but I think it's a very compelling argument that if you're going to make up something like this, and it's going to come up in multiple sources very soon after the event in question, why would you choose women as your witnesses? Because in that culture, the testimony of women was not respected as much. So those are some of the scenarios here where I would say, I think actually the tradition about the burial by Joseph of Arimathea, and it's being witnessed by by these 2 Christian women, these are good, powerful points of historical evidence that Paulogia doesn't really engage. I think the more interesting discussion would be to go into those points and for someone to make a counter argument. And people like Bart Ehrman do that. He tries to argue against the historicity of the burial by Joseph of Arimathea. Paulogia, by my lights, just kind of skirts around that. He doesn't really give a counter argument. And I found that really problematic, especially if these events are going to be cast as uncontroversial.
Well, to be fair, he also does attempt to say at the beginning that a scholarly defense would require a book to be written for each one of these points. So maybe he has in mind that he has more arguments and stuff in defense of these claims. I just can't see what that argument would be, at least in this case, because what he says here, I've got the article pulled up so you guys can actually just read it. It may be a little bit easier for you. He says, in the expected scenarios, this is how he concludes this section. The location of Jesus' body remains unknown. For it to be otherwise would require the same authorities who condemned Jesus to honor him merely hours later, a notion nearly as implausible as a resurrection. So it sounds like what he wants to say is that something like a Joseph of Arimathea story has a similar low prior probability. It's inherently as unlikely as some sort of miracle occurring. But I just want to know, what is the argument for that conclusion? Because it seems to me like we have multiple stories across human culture where there are these people that are in power, but nevertheless, there are people in that regime that go against the ruling of the governing body. So for example, you guys ever seen the movie Valkyrie? Is that the right? It was with Tom Cruise. It was about the Nazis. Tom Cruise played a guy who was basically trying to usurp and kill Hitler, but he was a Nazi himself. I can't remember if that's the name, Valkyrie. Anyways, there are groups. Is that it?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So there can be people within a regime that disagree with the other body members and go against it and want to, so a Joseph of Arimathea story doesn't seem too implausible. It's one person, Joseph, who decided, hey, look, actually, I want to kind of give this guy, at least give him an honorable burial. He may be the Messiah. I know we just crucified him and stuff, but he could be dealing with guilt. And so it just doesn't seem that implausible, to me at least. So I would want to know what the argument is that he's got in defense of that claim. But again, what we're going to do... On that?
Oh, sorry, Cameron, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I was just going to say, what we're about to do is look in detail at the sources that he cites here, because that's a big problem.
Just real quick, I understand he qualifies it saying you need a full scholarly case to really vet this, but I don't need a scholarly argument. I just need some kind of argument for why he wouldn't take seriously the story of Joseph of Arimathea. I didn't really get an argument to that end. And when Bart Ehrman says that, there's a contradiction between one member of the Sanhedrin having one opinion and the Sanhedrin as a whole having a different opinion, this is one of the reasons he rejects the role of Joseph in the burial. I just want to say, hasn't he been a part of a committee meeting? Hasn't he been a part of any sort of faculty meeting where you don't always have unanimous agreement? Why is it at all implausible that there could be a single member of the Sanhedrin who dissents from the prevailing opinion of the whole, which is exactly what Mark says happens?
Yeah, that was exactly my point. Jimmy, let's turn it over to you. Let's get started.
Okay. So the idea that the rest in place of Jesus's body was unknown to his followers is patently false. Which followers are we talking about? Jesus had 12 core disciples that traveled around with him. That is non-controversial. It is reported in the Gospels and elsewhere in the New Testament that they went to Jerusalem with him when he was crucified. And so they would have known what was happening with his body. Peter would have known. Did they leave it on a cross? Did they throw it in a pit? Did Joseph of Arimathea take it? What Paulogia seems to be envisioning is Jesus's followers decades later didn't know what happened to his body for reals, but his immediate followers certainly would have known, and they would have passed on that memory to his later followers. When Paulogia, however you say his name, is...
I know, I ran into that as well, but I think it's just pronounced Paulogia.
Okay. Well, however it's pronounced, he's ignoring the multiple attestations that we have, that Joseph of Arimathea was the one who buried him. Gavin referred to this, and that we have this reported in all four of the Gospels. They are not all by the same author. They represent different traditions, with the synoptic tradition being one and the Johannine tradition being another. And multiple attestation is one of the key criteria that skeptical scholars use when evaluating, did something really happen? If you get it from multiple sources, then you accept it. And we have this from multiple sources. So we should go with it unless we have compelling evidence that it otherwise. What Paulogia tries to do is cite various sources to cast doubt on whether the story would be real. He doesn't even mention the story, but he tries to cite various sources. The first one, his footnote 10, is he says Quintilian Declamations 274. And this is in support of the idea that bodies were left on the cross as part of the humiliation of the punishment. Well, okay, so Quintilian was a first century writer, but he is not regarded as the author of the declamations. What the declamation, not today, what the declamations are is they're a series of imaginary speeches at hypothetical trials. It's kind of like modern moot court, where you argue a case that's not really in front of you. And so there are two bodies of declamations. There's one called the major declamations, the second one called the minor declamations. Paulogia doesn't tell us which it is. So I did some looking, and these are thought to have been written after Jesus's time, between AD 100 and AD 300. I did some checking, and it appears that the section he's referring to is not in the major declamations, because there's not that many sections. But in the minor declamations, section 274 does deal with burial and where it's appropriate to bury somebody. But, and I translated this from Latin, but what it's talking about is a tyrant who's been struck by lightning, because there was a previous custom of, if someone gets struck by lightning, you bury him where he got struck. And the question was, well, if a tyrant, a bad guy, gets struck by lightning, in a city, should you bury him right there in a city where his tomb is going to become prominent and remembered? And so that's the issue that's being debated. It's about tyrants and how tyrants die. It is not about Jesus. This is irrelevant to Jesus's case. Also, Paulogia then goes on to cite another source, which is in his footnote 11. He cites Scott, who is a modern author editor, The Civil Law, and then he gives a citation of 48.21.1. Well,
let me actually go down and jump to that. Yeah, Scott Civil Law 48.21.1. Okay.
Yeah. So, well, that's a typo, because if you look in the civil law, this is a law code that was compiled under the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century AD. And if you look at that section, it has nothing to do with any of this. What does is a neighboring section, which is 48.24.1. And so we've got at least a typo here, which raises questions, and his misuse of this source raises questions in my mind about, did Paulogia even look this up? Because when you look at the section, here's what it says.
Well, I've got it actually pulled up here. We can take a look at it.
It says, 1, Ulpianus on the duties of the proconsul, book 9. So this is the source that the civil law code is quoting. The bodies of those who are condemned to death should not be refused their relatives. And the divine Augustus, in the 10th book on his life, said that this rule had been observed. So note that in the time of the divine Augustus, which was the end of the 1st century BC up to AD 14, this was the rule. If the relatives ask for the body, you give it to them. At present, so now Ulpianus is talking about his own time, and Ulpianus lived between 170 and 233 AD. So this is like 2 centuries after Jesus' time. There is a new rule. At present, the bodies of those who have been punished are only buried when this has been requested and permission granted, and sometimes it is not permitted, especially where persons who have been convicted of high treason. Even the bodies of those who have been sentenced to be burned can be claimed in order that their bones and ashes, after having been collected, may be buried. So what Ulpianus is saying, that the rule in Augustus's time, which is effectively Jesus's time, was if the relatives asked for the body, you give it to them. By Ulpianus's time, 2 centuries later, it was a little bit more restrictive than that. Sometimes they wouldn't give the body back in cases of treason, but only sometimes. Even here, he doesn't give an absolute rule. So this it illustrates for us how Paulogia is misusing this source, because he cites it in defense of the claim that if a Judean religious exemption existed for giving the bodies to be buried, he says, despite explicit records to the contrary regarding Jesus's case of treason. So he's saying, well, Jesus was crucified for treason, and they didn't give bodies back in that case. But that's not what the source he is citing says. It says they only sometimes didn't give it back in cases of treason. And this was 2 centuries later, and it says the rule in Jesus's time was just give it back. Then there is the issue of, was there a Jewish religious exemption? And we've got a bunch of evidence on that, which I'll just summarize briefly so that we'll have a chance for Gavin to comment on point 4. But
really quick, I did also want to point out in this source that you just mentioned,
Yep.
in footnote, was it 11? Footnote 11 that we've been discussing. If you just scroll down 2 sections, it says, and this I think is from an even later time, the bodies of persons who have been punished should be given to whoever requests them for the purpose of burial. And that's
Right.
just,
And
that seems
that-
almost explicitly contradictory with the previous section here. And that's because, and Jimmy, you can just maybe talk a little bit more about this. That's because this is a collection of different rulings from the area from different time periods.
Yes. Now, Paulus, who is the author of that third section there, the quotation given there, he was a contemporary of Ulpianus. They lived at about the same time, so a couple of centuries after Jesus. And so Paulus attests that in his legal experience, bodies were just given to whoever requested them for burial, which is a more open liberal policy than the one that Ulpianus was describing as effective in his day. And you're right, the way this code works is it's a collection of different legal traditions that then have to be harmonized and applied by the judges. So to the extent this even addresses the situation at Jesus's time, it's Caesar Augustus's policy of just give the body to the family. But we've got a lot of evidence, which I don't have really time to go through. But if you'd like to read a significant discussion of it, check out Craig Evans's chapter on this in How God Became Jesus. But basically, we have a bunch of statements from Philo of Alexandria and Josephus, the Jewish historian from the 1st century, who both acknowledge that the Roman authorities in peacetime in Palestine would give the bodies over of people who had been crucified. And there was a very good reason they did that, because when you're crucified, you're hung on a piece of wood, and the word in Hebrew for wood and tree is the same. And so Jews would look at crucifixion and say the law from Deuteronomy applies, that if you hang somebody on a tree, that person is cursed. And in order to avoid defiling the land, you got to get him off that tree and bury him the same day. Otherwise, it's going to defile the land. And so to keep Jews from being horrified and revolting at the idea that their land is being desecrated by Roman crucifixions in the eyes of God, they demanded that the Roman authorities would turn over the bodies in order to get them buried the same day. That's also the motive for breaking the legs of the crucified, so they can't keep pulling themselves up and taking breaths. They'll die much quicker if you break the legs. And we even have archaeological evidence of that, because we discovered the bone of a man named Yehohanan, who had been crucified. And we know that because his feet have a crucifixion nail in them. They couldn't get the nail out because it had bent, so they just buried his feet with the nail. And those legs had been broken. So we have attestation here, both to the fact that the Roman authorities did allow crucified criminals to have their legs broken and be buried the same day in deference to the law of Deuteronomy. In fact, as Evans points out, we have dozens and perhaps more than 100 crucifixion nails that have been found in tombs. So we have abundant evidence for the Romans allowing crucified men to be taken off the crosses in Palestine in peacetime. So Paulogia appears to just be unfamiliar with the sources regarding this. His argument that the family would have had, he brings Mary into this, saying, well, she would have had obstacles getting the body to Nazareth for burial.
Jimmy, real quick, before you respond to that, we'll actually come back to it. I want to get Gavin's thought on number 4, and we'll just kind of read it out here. It's a really quick one, so we'll just get Gavin's thoughts. He's got to head out in like 4 minutes. We'll get his thoughts on number 4. We'll jump back into number 3, and then we'll just continue, you and me. So, okay, number 4, this Jesus had some followers while he was alive, but most disappeared into lives never recorded by reliable history, never to be heard from again, all except Simon Peter and possibly John. And then what he says here, you guys can see on the screen, despite self-serving and often fanciful church traditions arising centuries later, only Peter and John of, quote, the 12 are regularly mentioned in events after Jesus' ascension. In his comprehensive study, Sean McDowell acknowledges that Peter is the sole member of the 12 for whom there is high confidence of martyrdom. So, Gavin, let's get your thoughts on this before you got to go.
Yeah, and Jimmy did a great job on point 3 there. I just want to say too, if people watching this want to look up Deuteronomy 21, is the passage he mentioned that forbade leaving up the body overnight. And so I thought he covered that really well. On this point, this is the most problematic one of all, I think, because he's got these 2 sentences that's very brief and don't actually logically support the event that is stated in bold, so far as I can see. He talks about martyrdom, but that's a separate issue from attestation of the resurrection. So those are 2 separate issues that sort of get conflated in that second sentence that he has there. That's one problem. The more basically, I would say two concerns with this point that I think make this just really a poor statement. First is the arbitrariness of the criteria. He mentions in the first sentence regular mentioning of Jesus's disciples after the ascension, to which I respond, well, why exclude the historical data prior to the ascension, like the Gospels and Acts chapter 1, where a lot of the disciples are mentioned? Does being before that event somehow change the historical status? That is, I think that's how he tries to get around what most people would accept, and that's the historicity of these specific 12 apostles. They're mentioned not just in the New Testament, but you have lots of references to the 12 outside the New Testament, even some very early on, like in the Didache. E.P. Sanders says basically this is one of the most indisputable facts of history, that Jesus had these 12 apostles. So I think there's an arbitrary criterion here that allows him to try to focus just on Peter and possibly John, but we know why he wants to only focus on that one person. One thing that I won't get to say later is another problem, I think, in his theory is the idea that Peter would have been able single-handedly to convince all the other disciples of Jesus' resurrection. That's kind of another issue. But my main thing on this is I just think even with that restriction that he gives of regular mentioning post-ascension, we simply do have a good historical attestation of other disciples of Christ. James, the brother of Jesus, would be one. So Josephus mentions the deaths of both Jameses, James, the brother of Christ, and James, the brother of John. And we have lots of attestation of James, the brother of Christ, throughout the New Testament in Acts 15, in Acts 21, in Galatians 1 and 2, in 1 Corinthians 15:7, most people think, in Jude 1, and then we have the book of James. And some will dispute here and there which James we're talking about, but most people think this is James, the brother of Christ. So he's trying to contract down the number of witnesses to the resurrection because that's necessary for his case. But to do that, he has to do both of these things. First, give an arbitrary limit of the allowable historical data. And then second, and I think we've brought this up before, is there's just counter evidence that he doesn't really get into. There's good historical evidence that James, the brother of Jesus, existed, and you can't just sort of exclude a figure like that from visibility and not get into the question of his existence. So that statement as it stands, I'm just reading it from your screen. This Jesus had some followers while he was alive, but most disappeared into lives never recorded by reliable history, never to be heard from again, all except Simon Peter and possibly John. He would need to get into the historical evidence for the other 11 and explain why it's not good. And he, he really glides around that whole question here. So I think this is, by my lights, the most problematic one. And I'm really bummed that I won't get to hear what you guys think about this because I have to run. But I will watch this video later, and I'll be curious what you guys have to say.
Okay. All right, Gavin. Well, thanks for joining us with the time that you did have. So, thanks again.
Great to be with you guys. See you guys later.
All right, so now we are down to Jimmy and I. So let's hold your thoughts on number 4. Let's backtrack and go back up to number 3, and let's kind of pick up where we left off. So we were basically on this section. We discussed if a Judean religious exemption existed, the responsibility would have fallen to the family to successfully petition those in power, which I think is also called into question, at least with respect to the citation that he quotes here. There are other, literally another source in the same exact work that he mentions. The bodies of persons who have been punished should be given to whoever requests them for the purpose of burial. Again, this is coming a couple centuries after Jesus. So, but again, this is just not what we should be pointing to make the sorts of claims that Paulogia wants to make here. So, but anyways, let's move on to the next sentence, which is also controversial. Mary, being of modest means and lacking influence, would have faced significant obstacles in securing the body and transporting it from Jerusalem to Nazareth for a simple pit grave.
Well, if Caesar Augustus's policy was being followed, as we have evidence it was from Josephus and Philo and others, as well as archaeological evidence with dozens and perhaps more than 100 crucifixion nails found in Jewish tombs in the Jerusalem area, then Mary wouldn't have had any problems securing the body. She could have just gone and requested it. However, you don't need influence to do that if you're a family member. However, she wouldn't have done that and then buried the body in Nazareth, because Nazareth is over a day's walk from Jerusalem. And the law is if someone's been hung on a tree, you got to bury them the same day. In fact, even though the law only says bury the hung people the same day, this has become a generalized rule in Judaism, such that funerals in general tend to be done the same day. And given the evidence we have that Jesus only died shortly before nightfall, there was absolutely no way to get to Nazareth in that amount of time. So we would not expect Mary to take the body to Nazareth and bury it there. It had to be buried in the Jerusalem area. What could have happened under Jewish law, because they did burial in 2 stages. There was an initial burial where you put them in one environment and then you let the flesh decompose. And then a year later, you came back, you got the bones, you cleaned the bones, and you put the bones in an ossuary or a bone box, a bone container. And that was the secondary burial. So what could have happened, they had to bury him in Jerusalem after the crucifixion because of the law. And then a year later, Mary could have come back and gotten the bones and reinterred them in Nazareth in a family plot. But that's the only way they would have gone to Nazareth. And the resurrection intervened, so that didn't happen. Let's continue on with the next sentence.
In the absence of family, the priesthood would have taken charge. However, Jewish law mandated that criminals be left in separate, designated graveyards of the condemned in a dishonorable and secretive manner. And here he quotes Josephus. The Antiquities of the Jews, 4, section 202, which I actually have pulled up here. There we go.
So he's right that the priesthood, which was also in charge of the ritual purity of Jerusalem, could intervene. And Evans points out, and that's exactly what happened. The priesthood and the ruling authorities, the Sanhedrin, could intervene, and we know that Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin. So, as one of the local Jewish authorities, he was responsible for helping in this regard, and he did. So, this is perfectly consistent with the claims of the Gospels are perfectly consistent with what we know about Jewish law. What Paulogia is arguing, though, is that according to Josephus, that criminals had to be placed in separate designated graveyards of the condemned in a dishonorable and secretive manner. And that is not what Josephus says. What Josephus says, and here he's summarizing the law as it came from Moses. He's not directly quoting Moses, but he is summarizing the law, which reflects at least approximately what the general practice was in his day. But because it's a summary, it means it doesn't go into all the details of how it was actually applied. But what he says is, let one who blasphemes be stoned and hanged for a day. Let him be buried without honor and in obscurity. There is nothing here about separate graveyards for criminals. All it says is let him be buried without honor. So you don't throw a big public celebration. You don't have a big memorial service for him. And you bury him in obscurity, which Paulogia has changed to secretive. But that's not what obscurity means. It just means don't build a big monument to him. Just put him in a grave, put him in a tomb, whatever you're doing, but don't make a big deal out of it. Well, okay, so Josephus is articulating a principle, and it's not an exceptionalist one, but the truth is Jesus was not buried with honor and prominence. He was buried hastily without the full rites. That's why the women had to come back on Sunday to finish the rites. And he was buried in a private, unused tomb. So that is not a prominent place. Nobody built a memorial to him. In obscurity does not mean, the phrase Josephus uses, does not mean in a place nobody knows where it is. It doesn't mean a secret place. It just means without public honors in a prominent tomb, and that's exactly how Jesus was buried.
Well, in this same thing also says that he's got to be stoned. Jesus was not stoned. So,
yeah, true. So Josephus, as he summarizes the law, provides first stoning and then hanging for one who blasphemes. So this wouldn't, it certainly didn't fit Jesus because he was not stoned. He could have been accused of blasphemy because he identified himself as the Son of Man before the high priest, and the Son of Man was regarded as a divine figure. But clearly this law in its details did not apply to Jesus, which only further undermines Paulogia's case.
Yep. All right, let's move back up and see if there's anything we missed in section number 3, in the absence of family priesthood. We just discussed that. So, and then the last one we kind of already talked about with Joseph of Arimathea and all the sources that mention him. In the expected scenarios, the location of Jesus' body remains unknown, which is not supported by any of the sources that he cites here. For it to be otherwise would require the same authorities who condemned Jesus to honor him mere hours later, a notion nearly as implausible as a resurrection. Let me just reiterate that.
That's nuts. They didn't honor him by turning his body over so he could be buried.
Yeah, exactly. They didn't. That's not honoring a person. That's making it consistent with Jewish law. Again, going back to Deuteronomy 21:22, if anyone is found guilty of an offense deserving the death penalty and is executed, you hang his body on a tree. You are not to leave his corpse on the tree overnight, but are to bury him that day. For anyone hung on a tree is under God's curse. You must not defile the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. So they were doing what they had to do by putting him in or burying him properly. So yeah, it's really odd. And then again, he's cherry picking the data. He's ignoring the traditions that mention Joseph of Arimathea. And that's what was sort of puzzling. And it's been puzzling to me for a while now. When I ever hear Paulogia kind of articulate his theory, it just seems like he's cherry picking the data, is not really addressing all of the sources that we've got. So
Before we move on, I'd like to touch on one thing that Gavin brought up, which is the witness tradition that we find in the Gospels, because we have clear attestation that individuals who were known in the early Christian community were eyewitnesses of where Jesus was buried. And when you read the Gospels, it's clear, like if you look at Mark, for example, it's clear Mark is establishing a chain of custody for Jesus's body. He says these named women saw where he was buried. And the only reason to say that is to establish a chain of custody for the body. They saw where he was buried, then they came back 2 days later to anoint him, and it's the same women. So in Mark, the following people are identified as eyewitnesses of where the tomb was: Joseph of Arimathea, because it was his tomb, Mary Magdalene, and Mary, the mother of Joseph. In Matthew, it's Joseph of Arimathea, Mary Magdalene, and the other Mary. In Luke, it's Joseph of Arimathea and the women who came down from Galilee with Jesus, who, based on Luke's resurrection narrative, are most plausibly understood as Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, as well as other women. And in John's Gospel, we have the eyewitnesses of Jesus' burial being Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. So the Gospels indicate multiple eyewitnesses as part of establishing a chain of custody for the body. So Paulogia is just cherry picking the data by not interacting with any of this.
I also want to mention that the reason why he even includes this number, the resting place of Jesus' body, was unknown to his followers. Mm-hmm. It's important for his overall theory for the location of Jesus' body to be unknown. Why is that important? A little bit later on, number 5, distraught after the death of his mentor, Simon Peter became sincerely, albeit mistakenly, convinced that Jesus had appeared to him. If Peter knew about Jesus's burial place, he could have just disconfirmed his hallucinations that he allegedly had. And so you've got to have Jesus buried, or at least Paulogia's got to have Jesus buried in a place where people just don't know where it is. Because if they can just confirm that Jesus is still dead by looking at his burial place, looking at his bones, looking at his body, then that's going to disconfirm their hypothesis that he's risen from the dead. And so he's basically trying to preempt the whole empty tomb fact that apologists will often cite and conservative scholars will often cite as being some evidence for the resurrection. Because if you do have an empty tomb, that's a little bit more difficult to explain. You've at least got to have some explanation of why that's the case. But the point I want to make here is that this is sort of crucial for Paul's hypothesis that the resting place of Jesus' body was unknown.
And he needs it to be unknown from the very beginning, because otherwise Peter and the other disciples could just go look. I mean, if Peter starts, let's say Peter doesn't look, but Peter starts telling you, oh, Jesus has been raised from the dead. Well, okay, it's often pointed out the Jewish authorities would go look, but other disciples would go look too. So he needs this location to be unknown even to the disciples, even to the 12. And that's ridiculous. It is absolutely absurd that if they're there in Jerusalem with Jesus when he's crucified, that they're not going to know where he was buried. That's just a completely implausible claim on historical grounds.
Yeah, and I was really happy to actually see that he didn't mention or claim that Jesus was buried in a mass grave. I see that way too often, and it comes the reason why people think that would be like a plausible way that Jesus would be buried is because from the time of Nero, Christians were thrown into massive graves during that period when Nero was accusing them of trying to overthrow, and so that he was basically just saying a bunch of bad things about Christians, killing them all, and then throwing them in mass graves. But that was around the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and so it was a completely different time period from when Jesus was around, and the Romans were wanting to act nice with the Jewish law, or the Jewish people and all their customs and everything, and that's what Romans did, is they would basically appease to the degree that they could to the customs of the people in that area, because if they didn't, it just wouldn't work. Roman rule wouldn't work across the land. They'd have revolts. So they did as much as they could to appease the cultures and the customs that they were occupying. And so during the time of Jesus, I was just going to finish the point here. During the time of Jesus, they would have abided by the customs that they would have had no issue with, and even these sources that Paul is citing here from Roman law, which again is centuries after Jesus, there's no problem with giving the bodies back over to, in some cases, anyone who requests it.
And apropos of Roman deference to local custom, I mean, that's just good policy. If you're trying to rule a bunch of different people and they got their own laws, you let them follow their own laws to the extent you can, because that'll keep them happy and they won't rebel against you. And then you don't have to spend time and capital and manpower putting them down again. And we know also that the Romans regarded themselves as the most pious people. They viewed themselves as very pious and very respectful of the gods, no matter who the gods were. And they would even worship the Jewish God. You know, Caesar Augustus gave gifts to the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, and the Jewish temple every day offered sacrifices, asking God to bless the Roman emperor. So this was part of what they did. They were not disregarding of Jewish sensibility. They let Jews function under Jewish law, except where some urgent thing required them to do otherwise.
All right, let's move on to number 4. Let me see if I can skip forward in the video. I mean, I already read it out, so maybe we don't need to do that. Maybe I can just kind of reiterate what number 4 was, and then we'll play the video for number 5. Jesus had some followers while he was alive, but most disappeared into lives never recorded by reliable history, never to be heard from again, all except Simon Peter and possibly John. Yeah. Any other things that you wanted to tag on here with what Gavin was?
Yeah. So he apparently is thinking here of the 12. I mean, Jesus obviously had more followers than the 12, but he's concentrating on the 12 here. And he says, despite self-serving and often fanciful church traditions arising centuries later, only Peter and John of the 12 are regularly mentioned after the events of Jesus's ascension. Okay, that's in the book of Acts. So notice he's cherry picking the book of Acts. When it supports his case, he cites it, but when it doesn't support his case, like Jesus had conversations with Peter and the other 12 for
it's
40
unreliable
days.
History.
Yeah, he dismisses
it's
that.
Reliable when he needs it, unreliable when it contradicts what he's claiming.
He then says, in his comprehensive study, Sean McDowell acknowledges that Peter is the sole member of the 12 for whom there is high confidence of martyrdom. Okay, here's the thing. If you look in his citation 15, he does cite Sean McDowell's Fate of the Apostles, but he gives us no quotation from the Fate of the Apostles where Sean McDowell says that, and he gives us no page number. And that's because Sean McDowell doesn't say that. In fact, I mean, it's flatly false. We know from Acts, this is Acts chapter 12, verse 2, that Herod Agrippa killed James, the son of Zebedee, who was one of the 12. And in the Fate of the Apostles, Sean McDowell has a whole chapter on what we know about the death of James, son of Zebedee. It's chapter 11. And at the end of his chapter, and since Paulogia didn't give us a page number, I will. It's page 192 if you want to look it up. Sean McDowell says, the burden of proof is thus on those who would doubt the early, consistent, and reliable testimony that James, the son of Zebedee, was the first apostolic martyr. So Paulogia is misrepresenting McDowell here. It is not simply Peter that we have good evidence for martyrdom of. And we also have, although he doesn't mention it, good evidence for Paul's martyrdom as well. But here's another point. Martyrdom is not necessary in order to establish that someone is sticking to their story despite persecution. Martyrdom is just the most extreme form of persecution. But if you stick to your story with lesser forms of persecution, then we still have evidence that, okay, these people are sticking with their story. And we have abundant evidence, particularly from Acts, but also elsewhere, including Paul's epistles, that there was persecution of the early Christian community, including the 12. So we have evidence, even if it's not always martyrdom, that they are sticking to their story despite the fact they're facing adversity.
Yeah, I don't really have anything else to add on this one.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go ahead and move on to number 5, and I'll play the video. We've been playing the video. I mean, we do have it written, so we could just do that, but this is a YouTube video, so we'll play the video.
Of the 12, for whom there is high confidence of martyrdom. 5. Distraught after the death of his mentor, Simon Peter became sincerely, albeit mistakenly, convinced that Jesus had appeared to him. While potential causes are innumerable, a post-bereavement hallucinatory experience involving sensory perceptions of a deceased loved one is a likely cause of Peter's mistaken belief. Estimated to affect 30 to 60% of bereaved individuals during their grieving process, PBHEs can manifest through various sensory modalities, including visual, auditory, tactile, olfactory, and gustatory sensations, and may present as dreams, vivid memories, or hallucinations. PBHEs are common among grieving individuals and do not necessarily indicate mental illness.
Okay, so
we both wanted to come in on that. You go ahead and start.
So he's right that after a loved one dies, people often, not necessarily when they're grieving, but they often do report having an after-death communication. These after-death communications are known as ADCs. With the departed loved one. And the statistic he gives is approximately correct. Based on current research, around 40 to 50% of the population reports experiencing at least one ADC during their life. Now, I know a lot about ADCs. In fact, I recently did a couple of episodes of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on them. They're episodes 306 and 307. So you can go to mysterious.fm/306 and mysterious.fm/307 to hear all about modern research into after-death communications. They should not simply be dismissed as hallucinations, though. Some of them actually contain veridical information, meaning the person learns something from the after-death communication that they didn't know before, and they had no natural way of knowing, but it turns out to be true. So that provides evidence that this is not simply a hallucination, it's actual contact with the departed loved one. Having said that, is that what happened to Peter? Well, he proposes it is, but that's not consistent, especially the idea this was a grief-induced perception on Peter's part does not fit with the evidence. The reports of the resurrection are not expected. This is not a case where the disciples were sitting around praying for a vision of Jesus or something like that. They thought he was just dead, and then the women show up and say something other than, we just saw a ghost. They say, someone's moved the body. And that's the first interpretation that the disciples have for the empty tomb. Someone has moved the body. Then, when Jesus actually appears to them, they fall back on the ADC ghost hypothesis. They think they're seeing a ghost. So that's their second interpretation, because nobody at this point was expecting a resurrection in the middle of history. The resurrection was like this thing in the future, and it was going to happen to everybody at once. It wasn't going to happen to one man before the end of the world. So they weren't expecting a resurrection, and so they naturally fall back on after the empty tomb has been robbed hypothesis fails, they fall back on the ghost hypothesis. And so for a period, Peter thought he was seeing Jesus as a ghost. But then Jesus takes the initiative. This is recorded, for example, in Luke 24. It's also reflected in John 21. Jesus makes a point of having and John 20, he makes a point of having the disciples touch him and feel him. And he says, see my hands, see my feet, that it is I myself, handle me and see, for a spirit hath not flesh and bones as you see that I have. He also eats in front of them, specifically broiled fish, both in Luke and in John 21. So Jesus did things to falsify the I'm just a ghost hypothesis. And it was only then they concluded, wow, I guess someone did get resurrected before the end of the world. None of which Paulogia interacts with. He just says, oh, well, it must have been a grief hallucination, even though, of Jesus as a spirit, even though that's not, even though the disciples considered and rejected that possibility.
Sorry, I'm just pulling up 1 Corinthians 15. I want to mention this in what I've got to say about this. Let me go back to what he says here. So he basically says that Simon Peter, and he doesn't make this explicit, at least in this section, but what he wants to say is that it's only Simon Peter, the 12, that experience an appearance of Jesus, right? It's only Peter. And then he explains it by saying, well, it was this hallucinatory experience that he had. And a question that I had when I interviewed some scholars a little bit while back on this is, of the people that have these sorts of post-bereavement hallucinatory experiences, how many of them go on to believe that their deceased loved one has risen from the dead or is alive again?
Yeah.
Of that group, how many people can have hallucinations all the time, but that doesn't mean that they're going to go on and believe that that person was risen from the dead or is alive again or anything like that. So I feel like that's an important statistic to consider if you want to call out these statistics about people believing in people having these hallucinatory experiences. So
I assume the people you talked to said 0% of people who have these go on to believe their loved one has been raised from the dead.
Yeah, I can't remember what they said in response to that, but I think it's something along those lines. Like I don't know of anyone. I've never heard of anyone. But I also think that in most cases, what that would, unless you've got some sort of outside verification of this, or if you've got other people claiming the same thing, then it would be an indication that that person is mentally, like something is going on with that person. If they do believe that person is alive again. But in this case, and what he says is that it's not necessarily an indication of mental illness on the part of Peter. But the people back then knew that people, when they died, they stayed dead. And so, I don't know, it just seems a little bit interesting. But what I mainly wanted to mention about this section, let me see if I can actually, I've got the scripture pulled up here. Let me actually mention this, though. I did want to mention this book by William Lane Craig, The Sun Rises. If you guys have never heard of this book or you don't have it, it's a very small book. It's actually the abridged version of his academic book that he published after he completed his PhD on the resurrection, his theological PhD. It's a really, really good book because it's a sort of abridged version. It's very condensed of all of the arguments that he presents in his academic work. So it's very content-full of all sorts of awesome things. So I highly recommend that you guys go pick that up. And again, it's pretty short, so you can't get through it quickly because the arguments are so condensed, but it's just very, very good resource. So definitely go pick that up if you guys are interested in that subject at all. So the reason why I wanted to mention that is because, again, going back to number 5 here, let me go ahead and put it up back on the screen. So he says that Simon Peter is basically the only one who had an appearance other than Paul. Paul's experience was a vision, according to Paul, right? But Simon Peter's the only one who had an hallucination or experienced an appearance.
So in Paulogia's view, Peter is patient zero. He's the source of the contagion.
Yes, he's the source of it. But no one else besides Paul had anything remotely like this. Okay. Part of the reason why he does this, why he limits it to Peter, is that's how he gets around the whole question of how did groups hallucinate the same thing. Okay, that's a very common response that apologists will give. It's like, you've got groups being appeared to by Jesus. How do you explain that? You don't go to sleep one night and have a dream and then try to wake your spouse up and be like, hey, come join me in my dream. Those types of things are not group shared experiences, right? Hallucinations that you're having in your mind, you're not having that with someone else. That's what a lot of people will say in response to the hallucination hypothesis. And so some people get around that, like Paul, by saying, well, there weren't groups of people that were having these appearances of Jesus or experiences. There was one person who then spread it to other people. And so what I wanted to do was point out, like, okay, so there's this whole debate in the apologetics community right now. It's a very hot debate on the minimal versus maximal case for the resurrection. If you guys haven't heard of it, so basically Gary Habermas, who Paulogia is responding to, is very famous for defending this minimal facts argument for the resurrection. What he does is he points to specific historical facts about Jesus' life, like the crucifixion. I don't think he includes the empty tomb, but he includes the appearances. And he says that these facts are agreed upon by the majority of scholars. And then you've got to ask, what is the best explanation for those facts? And then Gary Habermas argues that the resurrection is the best explanation. And that's how he gives his sort of argument for Christianity. And now there's disagreement in the apologetics community about what method is the best method to use, because a lot of people will say, well, the minimalist case doesn't give you enough information to really give a high probability that Jesus actually rose from the dead, because it doesn't specify what type of appearances were that the disciples and everyone else experienced. You only get that sort of information in the Gospels. And so you've got to make a sort of maximalist case. You've got to look at all of the data, including the data from the Gospels, in order to really make a good argument for the truth of Christianity, that Jesus actually did rise from the dead. So there's this whole argument in the apologetics community about this, which method is best and which gives you a stronger argument for the resurrection. The whole point of me mentioning that is because this data that we're about to look at exists in the minimalist case. So this is not, the maximalist case is more controversial because you've got to argue for the reliability of the Gospels, more controversial. The minimalist case is agreed upon by basically everyone. Okay, almost every scholar agrees that what I'm about to show you in 1 Corinthians 15 dates back to some date it back to within months of Jesus' resurrection. But most scholars date it to at least within a few years of
it had to exist by AD 53 because that's when 1 Corinthians was written. So this is not decades later. This is within 20 years of it's not, the 60s or the 70s. This is at most 20 years later. And really it's before that, because St. Paul says, I handed on to you what I also received. So he received this from others. This was previously in circulation. So it has to date to an earlier period than AD 53.
Yeah, they call this pre-Pauline, I think is the term that they use. But this is what it says. Now remember, going back to just to remind you of what Paul's claim here is that Peter, and he doesn't say this explicitly, but Peter is the one who has the experience, and then everyone else just sort of, gets it from him. Like he tells them what he saw, and then they just believe him. Okay, that's his hypothesis. Here's why we're saying that he's cherry picking the data. Okay, this is some of the best material we've got in the New Testament. Okay, I can't iterate that enough. With respect to the resurrection, this is some of the best material. Okay, this is the creed that predates Paul. It was written in 54 AD. Is that what you said? It was written.
It had to be before 53. Yeah.
Before 53. And then this creed dates to some scholars, again, within a few months of the resurrection. But this is what it says. Okay, let's read it. For I handed on to you, first of all, what I also received, that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again on the third day, according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen by Cephas, or Cephas, which is Peter, Aramaic for Peter. And so that's at least consistent with Paul's claim here, right? That Peter saw Jesus. But let's continue. And after that, by the 11.
Notice that reflects the death of Judas. They're the 11 at this moment, not the 12. So this is very early before they replaced Judas.
Next, he was seen by more than 500 brothers at one time, many of whom remain even to the present time, although some have fallen asleep. Next, he was seen by James, then by all the apostles. Okay, that core right there, last verse 8 here actually is believed by scholars to be an addition that Paul that Paul added to the creed. but so the core is verses 3 through 7. Okay, so by Peter, let's note Peter, then by the 11, or by the other disciples, basically. Next, he was seen by more than 500 brothers at one time, and then he includes this parenthetical phrase, many of whom remain even to this present time, although some have fallen asleep. Like, go check for yourself.
Yeah, what that means is you can check this out. Go ask them.
Yeah, and then verse 7. Next, he was seen by James, then by all the apostles. And what William Lane Craig notes in his book, The Sunrise, is that the apostles doesn't refer to the disciples or the remaining disciples. It refers to some sort of unspecified group that were nevertheless still very close to Jesus. So by more than the disciples. Okay, so this is the earliest, some of the earliest material that we have that Paul is just completely ignoring. Like, he's not addressing it. He's not even trying to say that it's unreliable, which is I think just a scholarly bonkers view, honestly. Mm-hmm. So it's just odd to me where this hypothesis is coming from, given that this is not the most controversial case that can be made for the resurrection. Okay, this is some of the stuff that almost everybody agrees about. That he appeared to all of these different people. Okay, and you can explain those appearances however you want, but to say that only Peter was the only one who had an appearance contradicts the some of the best source material that we have on this subject, and Paul is just ignoring it.
Yeah, the way I'd put it is this is the earliest, most indisputable record of claiming resurrection appearances. It claims multiple resurrection appearances to multiple people, and it flatly contradicts Paulogia's Peter is patient zero hypothesis. So Paulogia's hypothesis is contradicted by the earliest, most undoubted evidence that we have regarding Christian claims for resurrection appearances. That of itself makes Paulogia's theory highly implausible. This does major damage to his theory that Peter just had a hallucination and then spread the idea.
Yeah, I think this also contradicts, what was it, point number 3 about him being buried in an unknown tomb. How do you know that he was buried at all if you don't know where he was buried?
Right.
But yeah, it's like he just, like at verse 5, he's like, he sees that Peter saw Jesus, and then he's like, okay, well, I'm good. I'll stop there. I'm gonna stop reading. The rest of it, just like, we'll just ignore the rest of this. It's just it's kind of strange. Mm-hmm. All right, let's move on to, unless you've got anything else to say on 5, let's move to point number 6.
Okay.
You took a breath. I thought you were about to say something.
Nope. I was okay. I wasn't sure what.
Just breathing.
I was. Yeah. Good enough.
All right.
6. James, the brother of Jesus, became part of Peter's Jesus movement, perhaps also one of the disciples named John. In Galatians, Paul describes meeting James, Peter, and John in Jerusalem, so we know they were all involved in the church. We don't know what any of these men believed about resurrected Jesus, nor what their motivations might have been for joining the movement, since they left us no first-hand accounts telling us. Assuming they came to believe in Jesus' resurrection, that could be explained by social contagion, a model of influence and persuasion. Peter's claim of witnessing the risen Jesus gave the shocked and grieving group hope, which they readily accepted due to bias, predisposition, and the power of Jesus' message. Peter's influence, group dynamics, and cultural factors convinced them of the resurrection through faith, just like every Christian believer since. Or maybe James just took over the family business. The possibilities are endless.
Well, they're endless if they're unconstrained by evidence. You can make any possibilities endless if you don't allow the evidence to constrain them. Sure.
Yeah, exactly. Oh man.
This is really weird. He says James, the brother of Jesus, became part of Peter's Jesus movement. Well, okay, that's true. Perhaps also one of the disciples named John. Well, here we're clearly talking about John, son of Zebedee. So perhaps John, son of Zebedee, joined Peter's Jesus movement after the resurrection. That makes no sense. I mean, even unbelieving secular scholars will acknowledge John, son of Zebedee, was one of Jesus's followers during his ministry. He was, in fact, one of the core 4 disciples. So Paulogia is cherry picking hard here, because we've got bunches of evidence in the New Testament that is not doubted by even secular scholars that says John was one of the disciples during the earthly ministry. He then says, Paul mentions meeting James, Peter, and John in Jerusalem, so we know they were all involved in the church. Yeah. We don't know what any of these men believed about resurrected Jesus. Wait, on your theory, didn't Peter, Paulogia, on your theory, didn't Peter believe Jesus was resurrected? He's one of those men you just named. And if they joined Peter's Jesus movement, then James and John would have also believed in the resurrection. So I don't know what he's claiming here, but this is really weird.
Well, yeah, and this also highlights the fact that he is discounting the other source, the gospel sources, essentially. So kind of going back to that distinction between the minimalist case and the maximalist case. So I was just looking at 1 Corinthians 3, which mentions the appearances, and then the maximalist will say, well, they don't specify what those experiences were like. And that's kind of what Paul is picking up on here, is that it doesn't explain in those verses, but the verses at least mention that they were appeared to, but it doesn't say what types of experiences they've got. Now, the minimalist will come back on that and say, well, we can actually infer based on the remainder of 1 Corinthians 15 that the type of resurrection that would have had to have occurred would have been bodily, and it would have been tactile. And so the appearances that they experienced would have been of that nature. But in the Gospels themselves, if you want to make a maximalist case or argue that the Gospels are reliable history, then you've got additional sources to contend with that give us the detailed information about what these men would have believed about the resurrected Jesus, because it describes the appearances in a very clearly bodily manner. So, but what he's doing here is he's discounting those. He's saying that it's unreliable without argument, and obviously, like we mentioned earlier, maybe he's got some great arguments elsewhere that we're just not aware of for unreliability. I highly doubt that, given what we've seen so far.
We have to judge him based on what he presents, not what we can imagine him presenting in another context.
Well, go ahead and continue on this section, this next paragraph.
Okay. So, first you'll notice at the end of that first paragraph, he's got footnote 17, and he tries to bolster his case in footnote 17. He says, scholarly argument and critical consensus conclude that the New Testament books attributed to James, Peter, and John were unlikely to have been written by them, though this case is outside the scope of a short blog entry. Even so, these letters hold no eyewitness details relevant to a resurrection case. Okay, some scholars, not a critical consensus, unless you restrict who you consider a critical scholars to just those who agree with your viewpoint, some scholars do think that it's unlikely that James, Peter, and John wrote these letters. But other scholars disagree. And personally, I disagree. I think there's strong evidence they did. But he says, even so, the letters hold no eyewitness details relevant to a resurrection case. Well, okay, they don't go into a lot of detail, but they do testify to belief in the resurrection. James, in the first verse of his letter, introduces himself as James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. So he believes Jesus is the Lord and Christ. Peter, in the first verse of his first and second epistle, they also identify themselves as followers of Jesus. So they believe in a historical Jesus. In 1 Peter 1:3, Peter gives a blessing. He says, "Blessed be God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who according to his great mercy caused us to be born again in a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead." So there we've got a mention of the resurrection in one of these letters. He also mentions God raising Jesus from the dead later in the same chapter in verse 21, and in 1 Peter 3:21. He says, baptism now saves you, not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So we do, even though they're not going into a lot of detail about it, they do attest to belief in the resurrection attributed to these men. Also, John's gospel, even if his letters don't discuss the resurrection, John's gospel certainly does. And there's not really a significant consensus in scholarship that the letters were written by a different author than the gospel was written by. They bear the marks of having the same author. Fundamentally, though, the case for the resurrection is not dependent on just these few letters. So that is a significant fact. We have lots of other evidence pointing towards the resurrection. Paulogia then suggests that social contagion originating with Peter could have convinced people of the resurrection, but this is just speculation. Paulogia has presented no evidence for social contagion. Instead, the evidence we have from the Gospels and other sources says that these men in the 12 were convinced by themselves encountering Jesus. And even James, who wasn't a member of the 12, James the Just, the earliest evidence we have from 1 Corinthians 15 says that Jesus appeared to him. So Paulogia is speculating about social contagion and not providing any evidence for that speculation when the actual evidence we have from the relevant documents indicates it was not social contagion, it was personal encounter that convinced all these men. Thomas, who doubted what they were telling him, being the most notable example.
Yeah, I don't have anything else to add on that. I guess we can go ahead and move on here. So,
Okay.
Well, I guess one thing before we move on is we did have a super chat sent in. So let's go ahead and cover that one. This one was sent in earlier. Thank you for supporting the channel. It's a quote here, unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. Hume, why always skip half? Cam, probability was duly considered. Not really sure what the point of this one is. That's something that I think probability theorists could actually agree with, the ones that respond to Hume on this. Unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. So basically it's saying that unless the evidence basically outweighs the improbability, the prior probability, or the prior improbability, the inherent improbability of the claim itself, unless the evidence outweighs that initial improbability, then you're basically kind of stuck where you were. And that's kind of what Hume is saying here. But probability theorists can actually agree with that point. What they want to say is that it's not the case that you can't get enough evidence to overcome any kind of initial improbability. There's a separate question on how improbable a resurrection actually is, which Hume doesn't address, at least to my knowledge. Maybe he does somewhere that I'm not familiar with. That's something that Richard Swinburne, actually, in his book on the resurrection, found to be really important to address. And so he actually did try to comment on that and provide some arguments for an incarnation and a resurrection not being too improbable, given God's existence. So I think, yeah, I guess in response to this, this actually is something that probability theorists can agree with in response to Hume. That's not the point that's in contention. Any thoughts, Jimmy, before we move back on?
Well, if I understand it correctly, Stink Yahoo is having a problem with your quotation on occasion of the first part of what Hume said and not the second part. And he says, why skip this second half? I would assume the reason is because this is simply concision. You can't repeat everything Hume says on every occasion. And so you repeat the core part to get the idea across. That's what I would do. And then in a more detailed consideration, you can look at both parts, and probability theorists, as you've said, don't have a problem with considering both parts.
Yeah. And again, this is not super controversial, what this actual claim here, but it doesn't undermine anything else that I've said, or people that respond to Hume. It doesn't undermine what they say. This part is at least, by my lights, it's consistent with probability theory. So not too much else to say on that. Let's get back to the claims by Paul. Let me go ahead and start.
And these go quicker
summary.
from here.
Yeah, they go quicker from here. There's not too much going on, but we'll go ahead and finish them out. And I think what actually worked well is that I played the video and then I showed the sort of script while the video was playing. So I'll try that again and see if it's helpful for you guys.
Business. The possibilities are endless. 7. Stories about Jesus spread through person-to-person evangelism, with the focus on recruiting new followers rather than accurately transmitting historical events. Details were embellished or invented to eliminate obstacles to belief, and the narratives most successful at winning converts were repeated. As the movement grew, Peter was not personally present to confirm or correct the adopted narratives. The Jesus movement grew for many decades before the first Gospels were written, so scholars generally agree that it spread primarily through personal evangelism and word of mouth, rather than through written texts or formal institutions.
Yeah, so here, I mean, he's just kind of going on and giving his theory without, I mean, here he doesn't even cite anything. He doesn't mention any additional sources. He's just kind of fleshing out his own personal theory. So there's not too much to respond here other than to say, cool story, bro. Cool.
Just briefly, so he says details were embellished or invented to eliminate obstacles to belief. Okay, there's no evidence of that. You can claim that, but you need to provide evidence for a claim if you want people to believe it, and you haven't provided any evidence. He then says, as the movement grew, Peter was not personally present to confirm or correct the adopted narratives. And that's irrelevant because the evidence that we have says Peter wasn't the only witness. And other witnesses were present and were able to correct narratives periodically as they encountered the narratives that were being related. He says the Jesus movement grew for many decades before the first Gospels were written. I don't have time to go through the case here, but I think that's just false. The first surviving Gospel we have is Mark, and the evidence points to Mark being written by the mid AD 50s. And so that's 2 decades, not many decades. Even if you go with with another dating of Mark, which is common, to around 65 to 70, that's only 4 decades. So he's trying to make the timeline sound a lot longer than the evidence actually supports in order to allow more room for the imaginary embellishment or invention of details that he has done nothing to document.
All right, we had some more super chats come in, so we'll get to those quickly. So Grays 174 says, "Why is he appeared to the Dodeca? I don't know, translated as to the 11. This is the first time I've heard of it. In verse 5 by the 11, right here. Actually, I don't have that on the screen, so you guys can't see it. Hang on a second. We'll go back over here so you guys can see by the 11. So this is the Catholic." What is this?
I don't know what that abbreviation is.
Catholic public domain version.
I know what that is.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a
I was
version...
actually looking for the ESV, and then that was the first one that popped up. I was just trying to read it out. So
I've got the ESV here. I'll pull it up. Let's see what it says.
Yeah.
The so-called Catholic public domain version is an idiosyncratic translation produced by a single man named Ron Conte, who wrote it and published it in defiance of ecclesiastical law. So it actually is not approved by the Catholic Church. But let's see
that's unfortunate.
Let's see what the Greek says here. He appeared to Cephas, then to the 12 in the ESV, and it does say Dodeca in Greek. Okay, so it would appear, big surprise, the Catholic public domain translation is wrong on this point.
Yeah, and the 12 I think is just it's a name for that group. So it could have had less than 12 members at that time. That was just the sort of proper name given to them. So,
or it could have
was just a mistaken translation.
Paul could be referring to an appearance after they replaced Judas.
All right, so Stink Yahoo has a follow-up. He says, no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle. He gives the full quote from Hume. No testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. And then he says, full quote, bozo.
Spicy.
Spicy. So, Hume obviously says more than just this quote here. So there's other things that Hume has said that scholars disagree with. I wouldn't really take issue with this particular full quote here, but other things that he said I've taken issue, and that's what people like John Earman have written entire books responding to Hume on this point using probability theory. So this is not the only quote from Hume that can be responded to or is problematic. So that's where the discussion would go to, but it's not really pertinent to today's show. So we'll have to leave that alone for now. So let's move back to, I think we're on, unless you had anything else to say about number 7, I think we're
not 7.
Ready to move on. Cool. All right. Number
8 comes after 7.
Let me just back up a little bit.
Or formal institutions. 8. Paul, a Pharisee who had been persecuting the new Christians out of a sincere belief that he was serving God, experienced a non-veridical vision of the allegedly resurrected Jesus. Profoundly affected by this experience, Paul became a believer and began recruiting for Christianity and writing letters outlining his theology. Per his own letters, Paul had multiple visionary experiences throughout his life, which significantly influenced his ministry and teachings. He was prone to them. His persecution of Christians may well have caused him profound guilt and cognitive dissonance. This psychological distress, possibly resembling post-traumatic stress disorder, could have triggered a psychotic break, manifesting as a vision of the resurrected Jesus. Paul's subsequent conversion to Christianity may have served as a coping mechanism to resolve his inner turmoil, alleviate guilt, and find a new purpose in life. 9. Paul.
All right. Yeah. I mean, what else is there to say other than that he's continuing to sort of speculate or kind of flesh out his theory. I guess what kind of strikes me is just how implausible it is. It's really difficult to try to diagnose psychologically what's going on in someone who lived 2,000 years ago. That's a very difficult thing to do. So already you're faced with that improbability of trying to figure out exactly what was going on mentally with this person, given the extant documents that we actually have about them. So that's already, I think, the difficulty that Paul and others that are trying to psychoanalyze these people are going to face here. But it's just going to add to the improbability of the overall hypothesis. The more detail you actually give to a hypothesis, the more unlikely it is. That's really important. So the more unlikely it is before you look at the data. Okay. If you flesh out a whole theory that has all of these different moving parts, all of those have to work together. And if one of those parts of the theory is improbable with respect to another part of the theory, then you've got tension in the hypothesis together, which lowers the probability of that hypothesis. If you guys are kind of losing me right now, that's just a way of saying that these really complex hypotheses it's more challenging to affirm them over a more simple hypothesis like Jesus rose from the dead. Much simpler.
Yeah.
And there's less moving parts.
I was just going to say it's hard, the theory is more complex if you say, well, first only Peter became convinced of this, and then he managed to convince a few other people, and then coincidentally Paul has this vision. Well, you can explain all that more simply with Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you've got to have a bunch of people doing very specific things before you even look at the data, and those are all going to be very unlikely before you look at any of the New Testament data. And so, it's just it's a very unlikely theory. But and I think that's why it's important to discuss Hume and to discuss the quote at the very beginning that we got from Bart Ehrman. That I can actually scroll up here. Here it is. Any other scenario, no matter how unlikely, is more likely than the one in which a great miracle occurred. Okay, so that's kind of where this is coming from. He thinks, or Paul thinks, that he can just come up with whatever theory he wants, and then just like conclude that it's more likely than the resurrection because it's got to be more likely than a miracle. So it's almost like he doesn't even care or have to care about how unlikely it is that he's just throwing all of these different things together, speculating here, speculating there. This person is involved in this specific way. Don't really care how implausible that is, but it's more likely than a miracle. So we'll just throw it in. And that's kind of what's seems to me, at least that seems to be what's going on here. So it's just, I mean, you might as well just start postulating aliens coming down as well. Like, might as well throw some of that in here. Some aliens actually rose Jesus from the dead, or
time
created
travel,
a twin, time travel. Yeah, you might as well just add in a whole bunch of other stuff because again, it's going to be more likely than a miracle. So why not add other things in and just ignore other pieces of data that we have in the New Testament?
You might have a Black Easter.
If you guys don't know what that is, that's a movie that Jimmy and I reviewed on the channel. When I first heard that name, I was like, what is this supposed to be? It's a movie that we reviewed about time travel, where people time traveled to go back and kill Jesus. What a wild movie review.
And then save Jesus.
And then save him, yeah.
So I had a few thoughts on point 8. The first one is Paulogia just asserts that Paul had a non-veridical vision, meaning one that did not correspond to reality. That's what non-veridical means. But that's, you can assert that, but that's no different than simply asserting Paul had a veridical vision. Paulogia also uses prejudicial language here when he says, for example, that Paul was prone to visions. That makes him sound like this is a pathological condition. And in footnote 18, which he's got there in that second short paragraph, he cites Acts twice for Paul having visions, but elsewhere he dismisses what Acts says, even though when it disagrees with him. So this is more evidence of how he cherry picks the data. When it comes to the basic proposal, as you said, Cam, it's very hard to psychologically diagnose someone remotely this way unless they had extraordinary.
It's hard to do it when you have the person in front of you, but then trying to do it from someone 2,000 years removed is a little bit more difficult.
However, unless the symptoms are really, really clear, but here we have to ask, does Paul fit the pattern of people who have hallucinations of this sort? And he's proposing that this is possibly some kind of post-traumatic stress disorder or induced guilt that Paul had for persecuting the church. So do we find any evidence that Paul felt guilty before Jesus appeared to him? Heck no. In fact, Paul is on his way to Damascus to persecute more Christians when Jesus appears to him. We see no signs of regret on Paul. So you can speculate all you want, but you're speculating contrary to the data we see, because the data is Paul was enthusiastic about killing Christians and was looking to do even more when Jesus appeared to him. So this what evidence we have contradicts the claim that's being made.
Yep, I don't have anything else to add on this. Maybe it would be helpful to kind of spell out what I was mentioning earlier about if you add more detail to your theory, then it makes your theory less likely. So you can apply it to like a real world case. Okay, my kids usually eat cereal in the mornings. So suppose that I walked in the kitchen one day and I saw a bowl of cereal on the counter. No one else was there. So I can explain it by saying my daughter made a bowl of cereal and was eating it and left to go like brush her hair or use the bathroom or something like that. Another theory would be that there's a bunch of fairies that came. One of them got the bowl out. One of them got the spoon out. One of them got the cereal
milk
out. One of them got the milk out. And, then they built this contraption to all like slide the milk down, slide the bowl down, slide everything down to this one area because they're all small. And then they poured the milk in and they had all these things going on. That theory is less likely than the theory that my daughter was the one who did it because it's super complex. That's one of the reasons why it's less likely than the simpler hypothesis. And simplicity as an explanatory virtue is pretty much widely considered to be a real explanatory virtue. So when you have two theories that are supposedly when you have two competing theories to explain some piece of data, you typically want to go with the one that is simpler, because simplicity is a virtue in terms of when you're trying to explain something. And you can see it, I think, in the case that I just gave. If you postulate a bunch of different beings to do something where one can do it, then it seems much more likely that the one thing did it, as opposed to all of these other beings coming together and doing all these things. So when you have more components to when you add more and more and more components to your hypothesis, that lowers the probability of it, actually. So you want to have as simple as you can. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying just go with the simplest hypothesis. I'm saying when you've got two hypotheses that are competing, pick the simpler of the two. Don't just pick the simplest hypothesis. That's not what you want to do. You can get in trouble doing that. And you want to, you have to this consideration comes into play when you've got two competing theories.
And just to add on to that, because what you're doing is describing Occam's razor, and from the Franciscan friar William of Occam, who lived several centuries ago. And the way Occam's razor works is you want to prefer the hypothesis that does not multiply entities beyond those that are needed to explain the observations, to explain the data. And so if you have two theories, you can't just pick the simplest one. You need to pick the simplest one that explains the data that you've got. Mm-hmm. And so in your, like, if you could, like, to give a kind of a cartoonish example, suppose I'm considering the hypothesis that God exists versus the hypothesis and that God created the universe, as opposed to there is no God. Okay, well, we've got evidence for, in one sense, the idea there is no God is simpler because it proposes one less entity, but then it leaves unexplained all this data of then how did we get this universe? So you need to tie the evidence into it. And to use your bowl of cereal example, you have good evidence of your daughter existing and of your daughter eating cereal in the kitchen in the morning when you find the bowl, but you don't have good evidence of fairies existing and fairies setting up bowls of cereal in your kitchen in the morning. So the simplest one that fits the evidence happens to be your daughter made the bowl.
And I think it's actually worse in Paul's case, because it'd almost be like I also had testimony of my wife telling me that she saw my daughter make the bowl of cereal and she was eating it. And then my wife said, well, she left for a second to go do something. We don't know what she went to do. But in Paul's case, it'd be like me basically hearing that from my wife and being like, I'm not going to really even listen to what you said. I'm not even going to pay attention to your testimony here. You said that you saw her, but I think my theory makes more sense. Like, makes more sense that a bunch of fairies were involved. So you have to be ignoring evidence, and then you have to be postulating a hypothesis that is much more complex than the alternative. And so it's there's a lot of bad stuff going on here. But let's continue. Let's go to number 9. We've got 12, so we got 3 more. Let's continue with the same process we've been doing. We'll listen to Paul and then read Paul.
To find a new purpose in life. 9. Paul met Peter and John, but they didn't see eye to eye. Paul went to Jerusalem to gain approval from Peter and the church for his Gentile mission, which allowed converts to forego Jewish law. Despite apologists' claims, Paul's visit was not to learn about Jesus' life or resurrection, as evidenced by his letter's scant knowledge of Jesus' ministry. When Paul states the apostles added nothing to his message, it suggests they provided no information beyond his divine revelations.
Yeah, so this one is it's also weird. When Paul is talking, he's referring to Galatians 2, where Paul describes a trip to Jerusalem where he met with Peter, James, and John. This is in the context of the Acts 15 council. And he says, they added nothing to me, meaning they didn't require me to preach circumcision. And so that's what he's referring to. And he didn't disagree with them. The Acts 15 council went in his favor when they had it. So they're in context, Paul is actually stressing that, hey, we agreed. The disagreement that he had with Peter, where he didn't see eye to eye to him, came later. This is in the middle of Galatians chapter 2. And Peter says it happened after Peter came to Antioch. And that was a disagreement about a minor matter, not the resurrection. Furthermore, even though I agree that apologists sometimes mistakenly are quick to assume that Paul got lots of his doctrine from the Jerusalem apostles, which he uses language that tends to discount that idea, it doesn't mean he got nothing from the apostles. He says in 1 Corinthians 15, I passed on to you what I also received. This is a tradition that he's gotten from elsewhere. He doesn't indicate it's a vision he had from Jesus. This is apparently a pre-circulating creed in the early church that he got from elsewhere. But in any event, this point 9, it doesn't do anything to disprove the resurrection. So it's a piece of theory building that doesn't really do anything in terms of Paulogia's overall argument.
Yep. I think we can go ahead and continue to number 10.
Just 3 more to go.
No information beyond his divine revelations. 10. Several decades later, Greek-speaking individuals who had never met Jesus or Peter began documenting these circulating stories about Jesus, the sayings attributed to him, and their interpretations of these narratives. The case against the traditional authorship of the Gospels is strong, though too involved to argue here. The case is nearly ironclad that the Gospels are complex literary works shaped by various factors rather than straightforward historical accounts. These include the recording of oral traditions.
Yeah, I wonder how ironclad or what he takes to be ironclad is some of the arguments he made earlier in this, or were they as ironclad as he's saying? The case is that the Gospels are complex literary works shaped by various factors. I wonder what he means by that and what his criteria is for having an ironclad case for something.
Well, I'm happy to say that the Gospels are, literary narratives that, highlight certain things that Jesus did in order to bring out significance, like the way the way Matthew works. He portrays Jesus as a new Moses, through literary allusions back to Moses and the Exodus, based on events in Jesus's life. But that doesn't mean those events didn't happen. It just means,
it really depends on what he means by literary works. If he's meaning highly fictionalized or something along those lines.
Yeah, literary shaping does not imply that something is not historically accurate. And in terms of his claim that that it was later individuals, several decades later, who wrote the Gospels, I think that's just false. I think that people should check out Richard Baucham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, for a very compelling case that the Gospels are based on eyewitness testimony, and we can even tell who the eyewitnesses were in particular incidents. So, he didn't want to go into that, and I understand that for length reasons, so I won't either. But one thing I will note is that they didn't feel free, the authors of the Gospels didn't feel free to just make stuff up about Jesus. A great example of that is in Mark chapter 7, where we have a dispute between Jesus and some Pharisees about why the disciples don't wash their hands in keeping with Jewish tradition. And Jesus has some comments about the Pharisaical tradition that he doesn't approve of, and he rebukes them for that. But then he goes on to say that whatever enters a man, like dirt on your hands, doesn't make a man unclean, because it enters the mouth and then it passes through the body. Although in Greek, it's a little more graphic than passes through the body. It actually says something more like, and goes into the latrine. But he also says what does make a man unclean is the thoughts that come from the heart. And then Mark, in an editorial comment, intervenes and says, thus he declared all foods clean. Now, whether all foods were clean or whether people, especially Jewish Christians, had to keep Jewish kosher laws was a big deal in the mid first century. It was tied up with, do you have to be circumcised? Do you have to be Jewish? Do you have to keep the food laws? We find echoes of it in Paul's letters, like Romans and First Corinthians. And the side that Paul came down on was, no, you can eat anything. You don't have to worry about it. Well, Mark is emphasizing that same perspective here. But notice what he doesn't do. He doesn't invent a saying and put it on Jesus's lips, even about one of the most controversial subjects in the first century church at this time. He doesn't make up a saying of Jesus to deal with it. Instead, he contents himself with drawing an inference from an actual saying of Jesus. And what this shows us is the evangelists, beginning with Mark, did not feel that they had the liberty to simply make up sayings of Jesus and attribute them to him. They had to confine themselves to things that Jesus actually said and then draw implications out of those. So this contradicts Paulogia's thesis that the Gospels contain just made-up Jesus material.
Yeah, I don't really have anything else to add on this one. We didn't play the whole clip. Do you think we need to, or should we move on?
If you want to, but that's what I had to say about it.
Yeah. Let's just move on then. So number 11, and earlier I said there's 3 left, and that's because I was like, there's that weird thing that happens. I don't even know how to describe it, but when you're subtracting like 12 minus 9, that's 3. But then you've got, if you're counting 9, 10, 11, 12, that's 4. It's weird.
At this point, we only got 2 left.
Yeah. That's the easiest way to put it. Okay, number 11. Let's scoot forward a little bit. Yeah, this one's pretty long, though.
Early Christian beliefs. 11. Occasionally, some early Christians engaged in disruptive behavior and faced consequences as a result. However, early Christians generally lived relatively peacefully, rarely facing ideological persecution, although it did occur at times. They were accepting of others, kind to the poor and widows, and consequently grew in numbers. Historical evidence suggests that the key figures in our hypothesis, Peter, Paul, and James, were likely killed in the 60s AD. If 2nd century historian Tacitus is correct, Emperor Nero blamed Christians for a devastating fire in Rome, and executed Peter and Paul as scapegoats, whose recanting would not have saved them. The same is true for James, the brother of Jesus, who was killed as part of a power grab by a politically ambitious new high priest. Beyond these 3, there is no reliable evidence that any other eyewitnesses to Jesus' claimed resurrection faced martyrdom or significant danger for their beliefs. The deaths of later non-witnesses, while unfortunate, do not serve as a guarantee of veracity of resurrection claims.
I do want to reiterate, though, that I think Gavin, early on when we first started this, he was saying that a lot of these facts seem unrelated to the resurrection. But what he's attempting to do is explain how Christianity began. So some of this is like this. That's the theory about the whole origins of Christianity, as opposed to the facts surrounding Jesus' resurrection that apologists and conservatives usually point to. So that's why you see facts like, or claims like number 11 here, that he's trying to say that some Christians engaged in disruptive behavior and faced consequences. That helps explain how Christianity began, at least early.
And by disruptive behavior, the only disruptive behavior we have is preaching the gospel, which upset people of some other perspectives. It's not like Christians were going around punching people or having riots or stuff like that. So I think he's kind of using a little bit of prejudicial language here with the phrase disruptive behavior, but preaching the gospel was disruptive. But you'll notice how even this, he's tailoring it to deal with resurrection objections, because he's emphasizing how like Peter and Paul, he says, could not have recanted and gotten off because Nero needed a scapegoat for the fire of Rome. He wasn't killing Peter and Paul because they were preaching Christ. He was killing Peter and Paul because he was blaming He was blaming them as scapegoats for the great fire of Rome in AD 64. So he wanted to execute his scapegoats. He wouldn't have cared whether they recanted their belief in Jesus' resurrection. So part of what Paulogia is doing here is he's trying to relate this claim to the resurrection. Having said that, let's look at his claims and see how good they are. Well, so the first Christian martyr, which Paulogia has basically ignored, was James, son of Zebedee. He was killed around AD 43 by Herod Agrippa, and you can read about that in Acts chapter 12. Well, okay, he wasn't killed by Nero. He was killed by Herod Agrippa, and James Bar Zebedee could have recanted. He could have said, "Hey guys, I this was all a lie. We made this up, or we had a vision and we took it as real, but I don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah or that he was raised from the dead anymore." And at that point, the Jewish authorities would say, "Let's keep this guy alive so he can keep saying stuff like that." If you've just extracted an admission like that, you don't want to kill the guy, because then, well, what proof do you have that he said that? Christians could still cling to their beliefs if you've just killed a guy who's made an admission like this, as opposed to keeping him around and keeping him saying stuff like that. So James Bar Zebedee didn't recant and was killed. Nero's scapegoating with Peter and Paul might mean that recanting wouldn't save Peter because Nero needed a scapegoat, but actually the evidence is that Paul was not killed by Nero. The evidence we have is that Paul was killed while Nero was away in Greece winning all these Olympic and poetry competitions. And Rome had been left in the care of a couple of prefects. And this is actually what Clement of Rome's letter says, that Paul perished under the prefects. It's plural. And so the evidence we have is that Paul was not killed directly by Nero, and he may well have been able to recant in order to be able to get out of that, but he didn't recant. Then we've got the case of James the Just that Paulogia mentions. Now, he was killed in AD 62, but the evidence we have is that he could have, and he was killed in Jerusalem. He was not killed over in Rome by Nero. He was killed by a very briefly servant high priest named Hananiah, son of Hananiah. And in his case, we have a 2nd century source. This is the 2nd century historian Hegesippus. You can find him quoted in Eusebius's Church History. This is Book 2, Chapter 23, Section 1. But here's what it says. Bringing him, that's James the Just, into their midst, they demanded of him a denial of the faith in Christ in the presence of all the people. So they're actually telling James the Just, recant, otherwise we're going to kill you. So he was given the opportunity to recant publicly in front of a bunch of people. But when, contrary to the opinion of all, he spoke up with a clear voice and with greater courage than they had expected, and confessed before all the people that our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ is the Son of God, they were no longer able to endure the testimony of the man because he was believed by all on account of the height which he had attained in his life of philosophy and religion to be most righteous, and they killed him. So this is the paradigm scenario that apologists talk about. He's given the chance to recant, in which case he'll get off, but he refuses to recant and announces his faith in Christ and gets killed for it. And this is Jesus's brother. Now, you can debate about what kind of brother he is, but he's some kind of family relation. And so this is pretty strong testimony, actually, and we have it from an early source. Even then, though, Paulogia seems stuck on martyrdom, no doubt because a lot of Christian apologists have overclaimed. We don't have evidence that all of the 12 or all of the 12 but John were martyred. In fact, there's even some evidence John was martyred. So we don't want to overclaim on this, but martyrdom is not the only way of proving your sincerity. Sticking with your story just under lesser forms of persecution also indicates your sincerity, and we have abundant evidence of early Christian leaders facing opposition and sticking to their story, thus indicating they were sincere.
Nothing more to add on that one. Let's go ahead and close it out. Let's get
Last
to
one.
number 12
Woohoo!
here. Last one. Centuries later, in 33 AD. Well, we'll let Paul do it. Let's back up a little bit.
How
There we go.
unfortunate. Do not serve as a guarantee of veracity of resurrection claims. 12. Centuries later, in 303 AD, Christianity was temporarily outlawed in Rome, but it gained legal protection 10 years later and soon became the Roman Empire's first official religion, marking its transformation toward the institution we know today. In short, to account for the established history of Christianity, and indeed Gary Habermas's minimal facts, we need only a single disciple to believe Jesus rose, and a later convert who hallucinated the same, and a well-marketed legend to spread. Supplemental embellishments like an empty tomb, group appearances, and suffering of other witnesses are not facts to be explained, but mere story artifacts of the legendary development described above. The ball is in your court, Dr. Habermas.
There you go. We did it.
Okay. Well, I have a little bit to respond here, if that's okay with you.
Yeah. No worries. There's obviously a lot to respond because he kind of summarizes. He's just says 12, and then he kind of summarizes his whole case.
Well, he does make some substantive claims here. Like he says, centuries later, in 303 AD, Christianity was temporarily outlawed in Rome. That makes it sound like Christianity was only outlawed for a brief period, and that's just historically false. Now he's part of what he's doing here is sketching, his theory of how the church emerged, and that's fine. He's not damaging the resurrection by this claim, but he's just mischaracterizing history. Christianity was outlawed in either AD 64 or 65, following the Great Fire of Rome, and that precedent stood. It wasn't always enforced, but the precedent stood, and thus, for example, Paulogia is ignoring cases where we know the law was enforced, like in Pliny the Younger's correspondence with the Emperor Hadrian, which is around 120 AD. They're still, prosecuting and even executing Christians at this time. Pliny says, he writes the emperor because he says, I've some Christians have come to my attention. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with them. I understand that they're typically prosecuted, and here's what I did in these cases. Can you give me your feedback? And Hadrian confirms that Christians are to be prosecuted, but he sets some kind of guardrails on witch hunts regarding Christians. But this is evidence that Christianity was illegal, and the precedent was on the books. It was just periodically enforced. So Paulogia is misrepresenting the historical record on this, and I don't know whether that's he's ignorant of the historical record, or he's being deceptive, or he's just being super sloppy, but he's not accurately representing that. He then claims that, he reiterates his view on just Peter originated all of this. That contradicts the creed that we saw from 1 Corinthians 15, which lists multiple different appearances of Jesus, including to groups, one as large as 500. And then he says that supplemental embellishments like the tomb, group appearances, and suffering of other witnesses are not facts, but merely story artifacts of the legendary development. Well, he can assert that, but that's just false. These traditions of the tomb, the group appearances, the suffering of other witnesses are multiply attested, and multiple attestation is considered one of the powerful evidences for something being accurate. You don't just dismiss stuff that's multiply attested. And frankly, we also do have eyewitness testimony here that contradicts what Paulogia is saying.
Yeah, and the stuff is just very early, as I mentioned earlier. 1 Corinthians 15 dates very, very early, and it seems like a lot of it is just sort of hand-waving away the evidence. But, I mean, maybe a more accurate description is just cherry-picking. There's a lot of cherry-picking going on with this hypothesis, unfortunately.
Well, I'm glad that Paulogia had a good cherry harvest this year.
Well, I think that's going to do it for us. What has it been? 2.5 hours? That's actually about what I was expecting this to go for. So, yeah, that was it's interesting. Like I said, I was very actually happy when I saw this pop up on my feed because, well, a lot of the atheist videos that pop up on my feed these days, like I don't really feel compelled to respond to. It's like, for example, genetically modified skeptic. A lot of his stuff is on cognitive. No. Sorry, my brain is starting to shut down. We've been going too long. Cognitive science of religion. So he's talking a lot about psychology and how it all works and that stuff is interesting. But I'm more interested in the arguments. I want to know, is there a good reason to think Christianity is true? Is there a good argument against it? And so I was really happy to see something like this where there's something here we can dig our teeth into. And unfortunately, when we looked into it, there wasn't much here.
Yeah,
So,
the real core of his case and the linchpin for his case is that even the earliest disciples didn't know what happened to Jesus' body, and that's ridiculous on its face. And the sources he cites, he's misusing, and they don't actually say what he thinks they say. And the evidence we have is all in the other direction.
but you guys can let us know
from Israel.
What do you guys think about this? I mean, obviously we have our opinions. We're Christians, we're apologists. But if you have a different opinion on what took place here, and if you want to defend Paul, feel free to do that in the comments. Be happy to take a look at this. And I have a feeling that Paul is going to be responding to this at some point. So
cool.
We'll see what comes of that. Maybe we'll have some discussions lined up. We'll see. But I'm eager to see what kind of develops from this, if anything. But Jimmy, it's great to have you back on the channel. We'll be doing some more stuff pretty soon here. So we've got some exciting announcements coming up on the channel. You guys definitely want to stay tuned, subscribe, and like, and do all those things. If you appreciate this type of content, you can also become a Patreon supporter. If you want to support Capturing Christianity, we need your help more than ever. So go to patreon.com/Capturing Christianity. Links to all that's in the description. Thank you guys for tuning in. We'll see you in the next video. We'll have a lot more coming up very soon. So see you guys very soon. Later.